Please be seated. Your body is a temple. How many times have you heard that? 1,000? More? How do you feel when you hear it? Because I admit that often I don't feel all that great when I hear that line. For me, that phrase carries with it a whole lot of additional, at best unhelpful, and at worst toxic thoughts and images. It's a phrase that drags along with it reminders of restrictive diets, all of which have ultimately failed, and memories of intense exercise regimens which proved utterly unrealistic, for me anyway. And it comes overladen with an awful lot of painful, heterosexist, racist, and patriarchal purity codes. Of course, it can be a reminder that our bodies, no matter their outward appearance or their inward condition, are whole and holy and good, and that we should love and care for them just as we would love and care for all things that are holy and good and lovely and loved. But in our culture, bodies which deviate from an intensely monitored and unrealistic standard of beauty or perfection are often either treated as objects, sometimes even objectified, or they are simply erased and disappear into the ether of insignificance. So, okay, it's fair to say that I have feelings about today's collect, which asks that we be made a holy temple. I think it's also fair to say that Christian theology has not helped with any of this. Christian theology has a complicated, conflicted, confusing relationship with physical human bodies, which I think is very weird because Christianity is all about the incarnation, right? God becoming flesh, born of a woman and dwelling among us in a human body. But the church has historically celebrated the incarnation while in almost the same breath also proclaims that our bodies are full of all kinds of horrible things that need to be controlled and rooted out and sacrificed. But Jesus himself, Jesus the incarnate human one, doesn't seem to be conflicted at all about human bodies. He washes feet, he touches ears and tongues, he spits and makes mud paste to cover people's eyes, he touches lepers and withered hands, he makes scatological jokes sometimes, and he even seems to revel in showing the disciples the gaping wounds left by the crucifixion in his body. Today's gospel is all about bodies. Mostly female bodies, right? Both adult and children, but also Jesus's body. He's keenly aware of the difference between the many unintentional jostling touches and that one very intentional, desirous touch that he feels. And both Jesus and the woman feel the power transfer in their bodies. And she sensed in her body that she had been healed. And Jesus clearly sensed in himself that power was going out of him. And I hope that I don't need to remind any of us that Jesus even goes so far as to create an incredibly memorable formula for eating and drinking, which is grounded in a profound mystical reality that bread is somehow really his body, and that wine is somehow really his blood. It's tragic that Christianity has such a conflicted relationship with human bodies, because Jesus, God, has no problem with physical human bodies in all their incredible diversity. Mostly, I think it's the ancient Greeks and the centuries of male imperial Christian theologians who followed them that we have to thank and lament over for all of this lingering dualism and the insistence on some kind of strict hierarchical binary division that makes it so difficult for us to accept the full, juicy, colorful richness of our individual embodied incarnation. As one theologian puts it, the failure to embrace fully our status as incarnated creatures has left us vulnerable to alternate, and I would argue largely negative, messages about our bodies. If we fail to fully embrace the incarnation, we become vulnerable to all kinds of negative images about bodies. And I don't need to spell out what those are for you. All I have to do is ask you to complete the following phrase: my body is too blank. And whatever negative, judgy, critical voice that set off in you, first of all, I'm sorry. But whatever that voice was, please know that it is the exact opposite of what God knows about you and your body. Because after creating the earth and all of its creatures, God declares it all what? Good. And then, after God creates us, human beings, and all of our messiness, God goes even further and declares it all very good, even supremely good. We must more fully embrace our embodied incarnation, because when we don't do that, it not only opens us up to negative messages, it means that as we become dismissive and callous and coercive about our own bodies, it becomes exponentially easier to be indifferent to and brutal with and oppressive of all other bodies. White colonial culture, backed up by imperial Christian theology, has for centuries made it far too easy, and maybe even required, to discount and erase and neglect bodies which deviate from a rigid ideal, erasing disabled bodies and indigenous bodies and black bodies and queer bodies and non-binary bodies and bodies of the poor. We must embrace a more whole and holy and hopeful theology that is grounded in the fullness of the incarnation. Dr. Heather McBride, in her book, The Wisdom of Your Body, which I recommend, by the way, she describes this when she writes, quote, "There is no body in which I cannot find the holy, because God is both inside all individual bodies and inside the body of humanity. There is no body outside of this interconnected web of incarnation that we are all part of. And this has implications," she says, "for how we relate to all bodies, our own and others. Remembering that we are bodies and that bodies are holy is meant to stir in us," she says, "the need to craft a social structure that protects and celebrates all bodies. Unquote. Becoming a holy temple has to become less about purification and more about loving care. It has to become less about perfection and more about celebration. It has to become less about control and more about becoming attuned to the divine that dwells in you and in me and in every living body. Amen.